This is 7 Days to Die, an open-world, voxel, physics-based zombie survival horror adventure tower defense FPS with stealth elements that was recently greenlit on Steam. All well and good, except the developers have made the crucial error of labelling it an RPG as well. Perhaps they thought it would be considered too niche otherwise. What is more likely the case is that they, along with many developers, subscribe to the increasingly popular notion that an RPG is when you play as someone in a game. To be fair, the fun pimps did misinterpret the genre in a less blatantly erroneous fashion. To quote their trailer, it wouldn't be a role-playing game without XP and skill trees, because there's no kind of character development more engaging than being exactly one better at lobotomizing the undead. 7 Days to Die isn't the only example of this diluted RPG classification. Infestation Survivor Stories has RPG slapped on its Steam store genre section, in spite of the fact that the only instance in which the game so much as pretends to have a story is in the title. BioShock also mistakenly professes to being a role-playing game. Yes, there's plenty of story and the world is immersive, but the moment your character gains independence from being an empty vessel and doing exactly as he's told by other characters in a linear fashion, coincides almost perfectly with the point where he loses the ability to speak like a human, thus eliminating any danger of character development. Now seems like a good time to establish what a role-playing game is, to a reasonable degree. I think it can be agreed upon by most, though not the developers of Infestation Survivor Stories, that a decent amount of narrative devices and preferably an overarching story are required. In my opinion, this story also has to drive the game in some way, so feel free to rule out games where the story seems rather superfluous, like Serious Sam 3. I'd also like to discount 7 Days to Die now, because the story there consists of notes you find that other survivors left behind, which you then use to find the corresponding survivor. Ultimately, it's just an additional mechanic and is entirely optional. The next point is lifted straight from the Wikipedia article, though only because I agreed with it. RPGs need complexity as well as replayability. This is a pitfall in which I can gleefully ensnare BioShock as much as I enjoyed it. The standard method of providing replayability is by allowing the player to influence the story in some meaningful way, which is the kind of mechanic that often separates RPGs from non-RPGs, but this example is more of a way of showing how linear games with a predetermined storyline don't qualify as RPGs, because you're essentially a witness to the plot rather than playing any sort of role in it. The concept that completes this trinity is the aforementioned character development. This can of course include skill trees and experience and the like, but if your character doesn't interact with the story, then what you've made is an MMO, assuming there's an online multiplayer of course. If not, you've made an MSO, or mortifyingly single-player offline game, which is arguably the most depressing genre in existence, and still not an RPG. Off the top of my head, I can think of 2 RPGs that abide by these rules that also happen to be 2 of the greatest games ever made. One of them is Mount and Blade Warband, wherein you aim to advance your status within a fictional feudal society by hiring and training your own band of merry men to serve greater powers or conquer them as you please. The story elements aren't exactly something that would make George R.R. Martin sit up and take notice, but they revolve around how you play the game and interact with NPCs. You can choose to restore exiled lords to their former rank or attempt to seize power for yourself, all the while acting through various quests which range from prison breaks to attending an excruciating monthly poetry recital with whichever noblewoman you're attempting to court. This may seem sparse, but the game is played with an endgame in mind, and it does require power balances and character relations to have changed dramatically by that point, so rather than the simple goal of surviving an infinite horde of reanimated corpses, it qualifies as an overarching plot. And to round things off, I could comfortably replay the living daylights out of it, and indeed I have. Hopefully this is helping to clear up just what is and isn't an RPG, but just in case, here's a couple more examples to put any questions to rest. Skyrim is an RPG, so hopefully no one can be outraged now. Although your protagonist is silent, he or she does manage to become the absentee chief administrator for every glorified after-school club north of Cyrodiil, so the character growth is more than numerical. Dishonored may also join the club, though Corvo's development or character profile is driven more by the player and is less substantial. Perhaps a controversial addition, and also the other all-time favourite of mine, is Crusader Kings 2. What you might accuse Crusader Kings of lacking is an overarching plot, seeing as playing the game merely requires your survival, much as with the zombie survival horror genre. But one of the things that makes CK2 so staggeringly brilliant and rather unique is that the story is a very well characterised history of your dynasty that unfolds as you play. I'd generally recommend that the player sets their own endgame rather than adhering to the score system, and the game is made with the same notion in mind. At this point you might be tempted to argue that user-created goals don't qualify as a story, and you'd be right if that goal was to kill a specific mass of zombies or find a certain number of NPCs or any number of goals you could set in Minecraft. But what you do in Crusader Kings 2 is simply choose when you want your story that is constantly unfolding and being narrated to end. It's no more an incomplete story than that of the unification of the German states would be for not including all subsequent world events to the present day. If 7 Days to Die turns out to consist of me plotting to murder the offspring of a generic male zombie and the provocative nurse outfit wearing female zombie to create political instability in an abandoned Vauxhall village, while the nurse zombie attempts to fabricate a claim on my left cerebral hemisphere, then I'll gladly introduce 7 Days to Die to my elitist RPG club, provided it also introduces characterization somewhere down the line. On that note, I'd like to point out that Borderlands is also excluded. Besides going out of its way to make you think that was fun and now I shall never play it again, it showcases the inventory screen management based fakery that developers try to pass off as RPG style character development so that their game can appear in more genre based search results. Actually, I'm probably being a bit too cynical there, but skill trees posing as full RPGs are poisoning the genre much as QuickTime events are poisoning all genres. It's for the good of role-playing games yet to come that I reluctantly strip Torchlight of 3/4 of its ARPG status and send it to languish with the countless other dungeon crawlers that couldn't be bothered to include much other than a floor counter to mark your character's progression. Disappointingly, Torchlight squandered the fame system in the game. If it had been a means of getting discounts in stores or a change in attitudes towards you from NPCs, I'd have considered it enough for it to scrape past the test. But instead all it does is give you skill points, so this clarifies that having 2 experience bars is no more a qualification to become an RPG than having 1 experience bar is. And I think this brings me to my conclusion, which is that RPGs are games that rotate around storytelling and characterization as a means of painting an immersive masterpiece for the player, and using skill trees and number-based progression as a standalone RPG mechanic provides, at best, a rather crude colour-by-numbers image. It's not an unwelcome feature in proper role-playing games, if done correctly, but if you're going to slap an RPG tag on your zombie survival horror game and call yourself the Fun Pimps, you could at least try to chronicle the protagonist's experiences beyond the notion of Dear Diary, today I improved by approximately 3 in the art of disposing of these bland cliched antagonists in a fittingly tiresome manner.